Pacific Grove, California, March 15, 1993. The coastal town of Pacific Grove had always been a place where artisans and craftsmen found solace in their work. Among them was Daniel Matthews, a 42-year-old compass maker whose reputation extended far beyond the California shoreline. His handcrafted navigational instruments were sought after by collectors, sailors, and maritime enthusiasts across the country. Each piece was a work of precision, combining traditional techniques with an almost obsessive attention to magnetic accuracy. On that Tuesday morning in March, Daniel's wife Jennifer arrived at his workshop on Lighthouse Avenue, expecting to find him hunched over his workbench as usual. Instead, she discovered an unsettling scene. The door was locked from the outside, the lights were off, and through the window she could see his tools arranged in perfect order. On the main workbench sat an unfinished compass commission for a yacht captain in San Diego, abandoned mid-assembly with components laid out as if Daniel had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." Jennifer immediately contacted the Pacific Grove Police Department. Officers arrived within 20 minutes and began documenting the scene. Nothing appeared disturbed or stolen. Daniel's wallet and keys were missing, suggesting he had left voluntarily, but his car remained parked in its usual spot behind the building. His personal effects, including a jacket he wore daily, hung on the coat rack near the door. Detective Kevin Thompson was assigned to lead the investigation. A veteran officer with 15 years of experience, he initially treated the case as a possible voluntary disappearance. Men in their 40s sometimes walked away from their lives, overwhelmed by stress or personal problems. However, interviews with Jennifer and their 12-year-old daughter Emily painted a picture of a stable, devoted family man with no apparent reason to vanish. The investigation took an intriguing turn when Detective Thompson searched Daniel's office more thoroughly. Behind a false panel in his desk drawer, they discovered a leather-bound journal filled with technical drawings and handwritten notes. The entries dated back 6 months and documented Daniel's growing fascination with magnetic anomalies along the coastline. Page after page contained measurements, coordinates, and sketches of irregular magnetic field patterns he had detected using his sensitive compass-making instruments. The most recent entries, written just days before his disappearance, described what Daniel called a significant discovery. He had identified a location approximately 3 miles offshore where his instruments registered magnetic readings that defied conventional explanation. The variations were too extreme and too localized to be natural geological formations. Daniel theorized the presence of something metallic and substantial beneath the ocean floor. Detective Thompson interviewed Daniel's colleagues and clients. Several confirmed that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Daniel had become increasingly preoccupied with his coastal research. He had purchased or borrowed specialized geological equipment, including a handheld magnetometer and underwater metal detection gear. Local marina records showed he had rented a small motorboat on 4 separate occasions in February and early March, always requesting the same vessel and departing alone. One boat rental operator, an elderly man named Gregory Foster, remembered Daniel's last visit with particular clarity. The compass maker had seemed anxious but excited, repeatedly checking weather conditions and tide charts. He mentioned planning an important expedition but provided no details about his destination or purpose. Gregory recalled that Daniel loaded several cases of equipment onto the boat, far more than necessary for a casual day on the water. Fishermen working the coastal waters reported experiencing unusual problems with their navigation equipment in recent months. Compasses would spin erratically, GPS devices would lose signal, and depth sounders would provide inconsistent readings in a specific area roughly 3 miles from shore. Several experienced sailors had marked the location on their charts as a zone to avoid, attributing the problems to unknown underwater features or mineral deposits. Detective Thompson organized a search of the coastal waters, coordinating with the Coast Guard and local rescue services. Helicopters scanned the surface while boats crisscrossed the search grid for 3 days. They found no trace of Daniel or the rented boat. The search was complicated by rough seas and limited visibility, but the complete absence of debris suggested either that no accident had occurred in those waters or that any evidence had been swept away by strong currents. Bank records revealed that Daniel had withdrawn $1,500 in cash during the 2 weeks before his disappearance, an unusual amount given his typical spending patterns. He had also made several purchases at marine supply stores, including waterproof storage containers, additional batteries, and what appeared to be components for building some kind of underwater recording device. 1 week after Daniel vanished, the rented boat was discovered drifting empty near Monterey Bay, 12 miles south of Pacific Grove. The vessel showed no signs of damage or struggle. The engine was out of fuel, and most of Daniel's equipment was missing. Only a single waterproof case remained, containing some of his compass-making tools and a water-damaged notebook with barely legible entries about magnetic measurements. The investigation intensified, but leads grew cold quickly. No body was recovered. No witnesses came forward with credible sightings. Daniel Matthews had simply vanished, leaving behind only cryptic journal entries about magnetic anomalies and an abandoned boat drifting in the Pacific. Detective Thompson worked the case for 18 months before it was officially classified as a cold case and archived. Jennifer and Emily Matthews were left with unanswered questions and the haunting possibility that they might never know what happened during Daniel's final voyage. The compass maker's disappearance became one of Pacific Grove's enduring mysteries, occasionally mentioned in local newspapers on anniversaries, but gradually fading from public memory. 30 years would pass before anyone would think to look beneath the surface of those waters again, and when they did, the truth waiting in the depths would prove far more complex than anyone had imagined. Pacific Grove, California, 1993 to 1995. In the months following Daniel Matthews' disappearance, Detective Kevin Thompson pursued every possible angle with the determination of someone who refused to accept easy answers. The official narrative suggested that Daniel had suffered some kind of accident at sea, but too many elements of the case didn't align with that simple conclusion. Thompson began by reconstructing Daniel's activities during the final weeks of his life. Credit card statements revealed purchases that painted a picture of someone preparing for an ambitious project. Beyond the marine equipment already documented, Daniel had bought underwater cameras, specialized waterproof lighting, and an expensive piece of equipment called a proton magnetometer used by geologists to detect variations in magnetic fields with extreme precision. The detective interviewed a professor at the nearby Hopkins Marine Station, a research facility affiliated with Stanford University. The professor examined Daniel's journal entries and confirmed that the magnetic anomalies described were indeed unusual. Natural magnetic variations existed throughout the ocean floor due to different mineral compositions in the underlying rock. But the readings Daniel had recorded suggested something more concentrated and geometrically regular. What particularly interested the professor was Daniel's hypothesis that the magnetic source might be a metallic object or collection of objects rather than a geological formation. The strength and consistency of the readings Daniel documented would require a substantial amount of ferromagnetic material, possibly iron or nickel-based alloys. The professor suggested this could indicate anything from an undiscovered mineral deposit to shipwreck debris or discarded industrial equipment. Detective Thompson tracked down the manufacturer of the proton magnetometer Daniel had purchased. Records showed it was a professional-grade instrument, expensive and sophisticated, not something an amateur would typically acquire. The purchase had been made 6 weeks before Daniel's disappearance, and the device was never recovered from the drifting boat, suggesting Daniel had it with him when he vanished. The investigation took an interesting turn when Thompson discovered that Daniel had consulted with a maritime lawyer named Michael Bradford 3 weeks before disappearing. Attorney-client privilege initially prevented Bradford from discussing the consultation, but after Jennifer Matthews signed a waiver, the lawyer revealed that Daniel had inquired about mineral rights and salvage laws concerning discoveries made in federal waters off the California coast. Daniel had wanted to know what legal steps would be necessary if someone discovered a valuable mineral deposit or historically significant object in international waters. Bradford had explained the complex regulations governing such discoveries, including the requirement to report significant fines to appropriate authorities and the process for establishing ownership or extraction rights. Daniel had seemed particularly interested in maintaining confidentiality during the initial stages of any discovery. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus. Detective Thompson began considering the possibility that Daniel had indeed found something valuable beneath the ocean and that his disappearance might be connected to that discovery rather than being a simple accident. The question became whether Daniel had met with misfortune while investigating his find, or whether someone else had learned about his discovery and acted to claim it for themselves. Thompson interviewed Daniel's business associates more thoroughly. Most had noticed his distraction and unusual behavior in the weeks before he vanished, but one conversation proved particularly illuminating. Thomas Wilson, a former business partner who had helped Daniel establish his compass-making workshop 15 years earlier, mentioned that he and Daniel had discussed the possibility of expanding into marine geological surveying equipment. The partnership had dissolved amicably 10 years prior when Wilson moved to pursue other opportunities, but the two had remained in occasional contact. Wilson recalled that Daniel had called him in February, approximately 1 month before vanishing, to discuss technical aspects of underwater magnetic detection. Daniel had been excited about a potential discovery, but had been vague about specifics, saying only that he might have found something that could be commercially significant. Wilson admitted that he had tried to persuade Daniel to bring him in as a partner on whatever project he was pursuing, offering funding and business expertise. Daniel had politely declined, saying he needed to verify his findings first and didn't want to raise anyone's expectations prematurely. Wilson claimed to have accepted this decision and insisted he had no further contact with Daniel after that conversation. Detective Thompson noted Wilson's name in his case file, but found no evidence of wrongdoing. Bank records showed no unusual transactions between the two men, and Wilson had a solid alibi for the days surrounding Daniel's disappearance. He had been in Seattle attending a marine technology conference, with hotel receipts and airline tickets to confirm his whereabouts. The investigation also examined whether Daniel might have been involved in any disputes or conflicts that could have turned dangerous. His business dealings were straightforward and well documented. He had no significant debts, no history of gambling or risky financial behavior, and no known enemies. Interviews with neighbors and friends consistently described him as quiet, methodical, and entirely devoted to his craft and his family. Jennifer Matthews struggled to maintain the compass-making business in her husband's absence, but without Daniel's specialized skills and artistic touch, custom orders declined. She eventually sold the workshop and moved with Emily to a smaller home in Pacific Grove. The family lived in a painful limbo, unable to grieve properly without confirmation of death, yet unable to hope for Daniel's return as years passed without contact. Detective Thompson continued working the case when time permitted, even after it was officially designated as cold. He periodically reviewed the evidence, searching for connections he might have missed. The magnetic anomaly Daniel had been investigating remained unexplored. The Coast Guard had no resources to spare for speculative deep-water surveys, and private exploration would have required funding that neither the police department nor the Matthews family could provide. In 1995, 2 years after Daniel's disappearance, the case file was boxed and moved to long-term storage. Detective Thompson retired 3 years later, taking with him the frustration of never having solved one of his most puzzling cases. Before leaving the department, he wrote a detailed summary of his investigation and attached a note suggesting that future advances in underwater detection technology might eventually reveal what had happened to Daniel Matthews. The compass maker's disappearance faded from public consciousness. Occasionally, a journalist would write a retrospective article on unsolved local mysteries, and Daniel's case would receive a few paragraphs alongside other cold cases. Jennifer gave interviews on the 10th and 20th anniversaries of the disappearance, hoping renewed attention might generate new leads, but no significant information ever emerged. Emily Matthews grew up haunted by her father's absence. She pursued education in geology and oceanography, driven by a desire to understand the underwater world that had claimed him. She earned degrees from UC Santa Barbara and went on to work for various environmental consulting firms, specializing in coastal geology and marine mineral assessment. In some deep part of her consciousness, she remained connected to her father's final obsession. The ocean kept its secrets for 3 decades, currents and tides gradually burying whatever truth lay beneath those waters. But technology never stops advancing, and eventually someone would have reason to look more carefully at the precise location where Daniel Matthews had detected his mysterious magnetic anomaly. When that moment came, the past would finally begin yielding answers to questions that had haunted a family for most of their lives. Pacific Grove, California, September 2023. 3 decades after Daniel Matthews vanished beneath the waves, technology had transformed ocean exploration in ways the compass maker could never have imagined. What once required expensive research vessels and government resources could now be accomplished with commercially available equipment operated by private individuals and small organizations. Christopher Bennett had spent 15 years as a professional navigator and marine researcher, working on projects ranging from underwater archaeology to environmental impact assessments. At 47, he had developed a reputation for thoroughness and an almost intuitive understanding of oceanic patterns. His latest project involved creating detailed magnetic maps of the California coastline for a private research foundation studying historical shipping routes and potential shipwreck locations. The mapping work utilized cutting-edge magnetometer arrays towed behind a small research vessel, capable of detecting minute variations in magnetic fields across wide areas of ocean floor. Christopher had been systematically surveying sections of the coast, documenting natural geological features and occasional man-made objects like anchors, cables, and debris from maritime accidents. On a clear September morning, Christopher's equipment began registering unusual readings approximately 3 miles off Pacific Grove. The magnetic signature was strong and localized, creating interference patterns that caused temporary malfunctions in his navigation systems. His GPS flickered, compass readings swung wildly, and even his depth sounder provided inconsistent data when passing over a specific coordinate. Christopher marked the location and made several additional passes, confirming that the anomaly was consistent and stable. The reading suggested a concentrated source of ferromagnetic material at a depth of approximately 130 feet. The signature pattern indicated something metallic and substantial, though distinguishing between natural mineral deposits and artificial objects required closer investigation. Back at his office that evening, Christopher began researching the area's history. Standard procedure for any unusual find involved checking historical records to determine if the location matched known shipwrecks, dumping sites, or previous discoveries. Maritime databases showed no recorded incidents in that precise location, though several vessels had gone down within 10 miles over the past century. During his research, Christopher discovered references to local magnetic disturbances reported by fishermen dating back several decades. One archived newspaper article from 1993 mentioned navigation equipment malfunctions in the area, included almost as an aside in a larger story about something else entirely. The article discussed the unsolved disappearance of a local compass maker named Daniel Matthews, who had vanished while investigating coastal magnetic anomalies. Christopher pulled additional records and found Detective Thompson's archived case summary, which had been digitized as part of a department modernization initiative. Reading through the investigation files, he was struck by the correlation between the coordinates in Daniel's journal and the location of the magnetic anomaly he had just discovered. The match was not exact due to the limited precision of navigation equipment available in 1993, but the general area was unmistakably the same. The case file included copies of Daniel's journal entries and technical notes. Christopher, with his professional background, could interpret the compass maker's observations far better than the detectives had 30 years earlier. Daniel's readings and descriptions matched perfectly with what Christopher's modern equipment was now detecting. Whatever lay beneath those waters had been there in 1993, and possibly much longer. Christopher contacted the Pacific Grove Police Department and was eventually connected with Detective Sarah Martinez, who now handled cold cases among her other responsibilities. She reviewed the correlation between Christopher's findings and the Matthews case with immediate interest. After 3 decades, they potentially had the first significant lead in understanding what had happened to Daniel Matthews. Detective Martinez reached out to Jennifer Matthews, who still lived in Pacific Grove and had never given up hope of learning her husband's fate. Now, 71 years old, Jennifer had spent 30 years in painful uncertainty. The possibility of finally getting answers brought a mixture of hope and dread. She immediately contacted her daughter, Emily, who drove up from her home in San Diego that same evening. Emily Matthews had become a respected geologist specializing in marine mineral deposits, working as a senior consultant for an environmental assessment firm. At 42, the same age her father had been when he disappeared, she possessed both the scientific expertise and the emotional investment to understand the significance of Christopher's discovery. The magnetic anomaly her father had died investigating was still there, still waiting to reveal its secrets. Christopher proposed a comprehensive investigation of the site, combining his magnetic survey equipment with underwater cameras and, if necessary, a manned dive to examine whatever was generating the anomaly. Emily insisted on participating directly, bringing her geological expertise and specialized underwater scanning equipment her firm owned. Detective Martinez secured department approval to observe the investigation, though budget constraints prevented official police involvement in the actual exploration. The team assembled over the following 2 weeks. Christopher arranged for a larger research vessel equipped with a remotely operated underwater vehicle, professional diving support, and comprehensive recording equipment. Emily coordinated geological analysis tools that could help determine whether the magnetic source was natural or artificial. Detective Martinez ensured all proper permits were obtained and that any discoveries would be properly documented for potential legal proceedings. On October 3rd, exactly 30 years and 6 months after Daniel Matthews had vanished, the research vessel anchored above the coordinates where his obsession had led him 3 decades earlier. The ocean was calm, conditions were ideal, and everyone aboard felt the weight of what they might be about to discover. Christopher deployed the magnetometer for a final verification sweep. The readings remained strong and consistent. Whatever was down there had survived 3 decades of currents, storms, and sediment deposition. The ROV was prepared for deployment, its cameras and lights checked thoroughly. Emily stood at the rail, staring at the water that had taken her father, finally about to learn what he had found. As the remotely operated vehicle descended through increasingly dark water, its cameras transmitted images back to monitors on the research vessel. Fish scattered from the lights. The rocky bottom gradually came into view, covered with marine growth and scattered debris. Christopher adjusted the ROV's position, following the magnetic readings toward their source. At 127 feet, the cameras revealed something that made everyone aboard the research vessel fall silent. Partially buried in sediment and surrounded by 30 years of accumulated marine growth lay the unmistakable wreckage of a small motorboat. Twisted metal, deteriorated fiberglass, and corroded equipment components were scattered across the sea floor. And there, still visible despite decades of submersion, was the registration number matching the vessel Daniel Matthews had rented on March 15, 1993. But what captured everyone's attention, what made Emily grip the rail with white knuckles and caused Christopher to immediately mark the coordinates with exact precision, was what lay beneath and around the wreckage. The magnetic anomaly that had drawn Daniel Matthews to his fate was finally visible, and it was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Pacific Grove, California, October 2023. The remotely operated vehicle circled the wreckage site slowly, its high-definition cameras capturing every detail of the scene that had remained hidden for 3 decades. The research vessel above maintained position using dynamic GPS anchoring, holding steady despite a strengthening afternoon breeze that rippled the ocean surface. Christopher Bennett maneuvered the ROV with practiced precision, documenting the wreckage from multiple angles while Emily Matthews recorded observations and Detective Sarah Martinez took detailed notes. The small motorboat Daniel had rented lay on its side, the hull fractured and partially collapsed from impact and decades of water pressure. Marine growth covered most surfaces, but the vessel's basic structure remained identifiable. The ROV's mechanical arm carefully moved debris aside, revealing objects that had spilled from the boat during its descent. Waterproof cases, some still sealed and others broken open, lay scattered across the rocky bottom. One contained tools immediately recognizable as compass-making instruments, their metal components corroded but their purpose unmistakable. Another held what appeared to be the remains of recording equipment, circuit boards visible through cracked housings. Emily directed Christopher to focus the cameras on the area surrounding the wreckage where the magnetic readings were strongest. What they discovered explained both the anomaly and Daniel's fatal obsession. Partially exposed by 3 decades of shifting sediment and currents was an extensive field of metallic debris, geometric shapes that were clearly artificial rather than natural geological formations. The objects appeared to be large metal containers, possibly cargo or storage units, arranged in a pattern suggesting they had once been organized systematically before whatever event had deposited them on the ocean floor. Rust and marine growth obscured much detail, but their regular shapes and constructed nature were undeniable. The magnetic readings emanated from these objects, their ferromagnetic composition creating the localized anomaly that had drawn Daniel Matthews to this location. Christopher noted that the debris field extended beyond the immediate area visible on camera, suggesting a substantial quantity of material lay beneath the sediment. Emily recognized the potential significance immediately. This was not random ocean dumping or scattered shipwreck debris. The arrangement and concentration suggested a deliberate placement or a concentrated cargo loss from a single incident. Detective Martinez contacted the Coast Guard to report the discovery and request historical records of any reported incidents in the area. While waiting for that information, the team continued documenting the site. The ROV's sonar mapping revealed the debris field covered approximately 40 meters in diameter, with the wreckage of Daniel's boat positioned at the northern edge. A particularly disturbing discovery came when the ROV's cameras focused on the boat's interior. Still strapped in the remains of the pilot's seat, partially preserved by the cold water and low oxygen environment at that depth, were human remains. The skeletal structure was clearly visible through deteriorated clothing, and a tarnished metal watch still circled one wrist bone. Emily turned away from the monitor, her hand covering her mouth. After 30 years of uncertainty, the visual confirmation of her father's fate hit with unexpected force. Jennifer Matthews, watching via a live video feed from shore, finally had the answer she had both sought and dreaded. Daniel had not abandoned his family. He had died pursuing his discovery, and his body had remained with his boat at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean for 3 decades. But the questions remained. What had caused the boat to sink? And what was the nature of the metallic debris that had drawn Daniel to this location? The ROV examination of the boat revealed damage patterns inconsistent with simple weather or equipment failure. The hull showed impact fractures, but also evidence of what appeared to be an explosion or intense fire in the engine compartment. Christopher documented extensive damage to the boat's electrical and fuel systems. Wiring was melted and fused, battery compartments were ruptured, and the engine block showed thermal stress patterns consistent with extreme heat. This was not ordinary mechanical failure. Something had caused a catastrophic malfunction of the boat's electrical system, resulting in fire or explosion that had disabled the vessel and caused it to sink. Emily noticed something significant when reviewing the footage. The pattern of electrical damage suggested an overload rather than a random short circuit. Every system connected to the boat's battery appeared to have failed simultaneously, as if subjected to a massive power surge. The sophisticated electronic equipment Daniel had brought with him would have drawn substantial power, but not enough to cause this kind of catastrophic failure under normal circumstances. Detective Martinez raised the possibility of sabotage. If Daniel's discovery had commercial value, someone might have had reason to prevent him from exploiting it. The electrical damage could potentially be explained by deliberate tampering designed to cause failure at sea. This shifted the investigation from an accident inquiry to a potential homicide case, even after 3 decades. The Coast Guard responded with historical records showing no reported incidents in that specific location, but they provided information about a broader maritime mystery. In 1989, 4 years before Daniel's disappearance, a commercial cargo vessel had reported losing several shipping containers overboard during a severe storm approximately 15 miles northwest of the current site. The containers had been carrying industrial equipment and were never recovered. Ocean current models suggested that heavy objects lost at that location could have drifted southward and eastward over time before settling on the seafloor. The metallic debris field Christopher and Emily were examining could potentially be those lost containers, gradually revealed by shifting sediments until Daniel's sensitive instruments detected their magnetic signature in 1993. However, this explanation raised further questions. If Daniel had simply discovered lost cargo containers, why the secrecy and legal consultations? Why his mounting obsession and unusual behavior? The answer became clearer when Emily examined the composition of the metallic debris more carefully using the ROV's enhanced imaging systems. The containers were marked with faded but still partially visible shipping labels and identification codes. Emily cross-referenced these codes with maritime databases and discovered they corresponded to a shipment of rare earth mineral samples and experimental alloy materials being transported from a research facility in Japan to laboratories in California. The cargo manifest indicated substantial value, not just for the materials themselves, but for the proprietary research data associated with them. More significantly, the materials included concentrated neodymium and samarium cobalt compounds, powerful magnetic materials that explained the intensity of the anomaly Daniel had detected. These were not ordinary cargo containers. They held materials that could have significant commercial and scientific value even after decades of submersion, provided they could be recovered and the research data reconstructed. Christopher discovered one final crucial piece of evidence when examining the boat's remains more closely. Wedged between collapsed sections of the hull was a waterproof camera housing, relatively modern in design and still sealed. Daniel had been documenting his discovery when catastrophe struck. The housing appeared intact, suggesting its contents might have survived. The ROV's mechanical arm carefully extracted the camera housing and secured it in a collection basket. As the device was brought to the surface, everyone aboard the research vessel understood its potential significance. If the camera's memory card had survived, it might contain not only images of what Daniel discovered, but possibly evidence of what had happened to him. Detective Martinez immediately took custody of the camera housing as potential evidence. The device would need to be opened in controlled conditions to preserve any data it might contain. Emily requested that forensic examination of her father's remains be conducted with dignity and that his body be recovered for proper burial. Christopher filed preliminary reports documenting the site, knowing that full investigation would require additional resources and specialized equipment. As the research vessel returned to shore that evening, everyone aboard understood they had uncovered far more than a simple accident site. Daniel Matthews had found something valuable, had documented it carefully, and had died in circumstances that suggested his discovery might not have been as secret as he had believed. Somewhere in the weeks before his final voyage, someone had learned enough about his find to take action, and that action had proved fatal. The investigation that Detective Thompson had closed 3 decades earlier was about to be reopened with new evidence, modern forensic capabilities, and the determination of a daughter who finally had the chance to learn the complete truth about her father's fate. Pacific Grove, California, October to November 2023. The waterproof camera housing recovered from Daniel Matthews's sunken boat was transported to a specialized digital forensics laboratory in San Francisco. Experts in data recovery from water-damaged devices worked meticulously to open the sealed container without compromising its contents. After 3 days of careful preparation, they successfully extracted a memory card that had remained dry and protected for 30 years. The card contained 147 photographs documenting Daniel's final expedition. The images told a chronological story of discovery and growing excitement. Early photos showed Daniel's equipment setup aboard the rented boat, magnetometer readings displayed on handheld devices, and GPS coordinates marked on waterproof charts. Later images captured his first underwater video footage of the metallic debris field, taken with a tethered camera system he had constructed specifically for this purpose. The photographs revealed that Daniel had made multiple dives to the site over several days, progressively documenting more of the scattered containers and their markings. He had photographed the shipping labels, identification codes, and damage patterns with systematic thoroughness. Several images showed him using tools to carefully scrape away marine growth, revealing manufacturer stamps and content descriptions that confirmed the containers held valuable rare earth materials and experimental alloys. What made Detective Martinez sit forward with sharp attention were the final dozen photographs on the memory card. These images, taken on what must have been Daniel's last dive, showed something unexpected. Fresh tool marks on the boat's electrical panel, wiring that appeared to have been deliberately loosened or rerouted, and a small device attached to the battery system that Daniel had clearly photographed because it seemed out of place. Emily Matthews examined these images with her technical background and immediately recognized the significance. The device appeared to be a timer-controlled relay, crudely constructed but functional. Its presence suggested that someone had accessed Daniel's boat and installed a mechanism designed to cause electrical failure at a predetermined time or under specific conditions. This was not accidental damage from wear or weather. This was sabotage. Detective Martinez reopened the investigation officially as a homicide case. She began by re-examining all evidence from the original 1993 investigation through the lens of deliberate foul play rather than accidental death. The most obvious place to start was with people who had known about Daniel's discovery or who might have had access to his boat before the fatal voyage. Thomas Wilson's name emerged again during this renewed investigation. The former business partner who had tried to persuade Daniel to collaborate on his mysterious project now warranted closer scrutiny. Detective Martinez obtained warrants to examine Wilson's financial records from 1993, looking for any suspicious transactions or payments that might indicate involvement in sabotage. The records revealed several interesting details. In February 1993, 1 month before Daniel's disappearance, Wilson had made a substantial cash withdrawal of $5,000 with no clear explanation. His bank statements also showed payments to various marine services and equipment suppliers, which he had explained at the time as relating to his own business ventures. However, one payment stood out: a $1,500 check written to someone named Robert Clark, dated March 10th, just 5 days before Daniel vanished. Robert Clark proved difficult to locate initially. He had moved from the Pacific Grove area in 1995 and had worked at various marinas and boat repair facilities along the California coast. Detective Martinez eventually tracked him to a small boat maintenance business in Santa Barbara, where he worked as a diesel mechanic. Now 63 years old, Clark had no criminal record and appeared to live a quiet, unremarkable life. When approached by Detective Martinez, Clark initially claimed not to remember Thomas Wilson or any work performed for him in 1993. However, when confronted with copies of the canceled check and the threat of obstruction charges in a homicide investigation, his memory suddenly improved considerably. Clark admitted that Wilson had indeed hired him for a specific job 30 years earlier, though he claimed ignorance of its true purpose. According to Clark's statement, Wilson had approached him at a marina in February 1993 with an unusual request. Wilson wanted someone to make subtle modifications to a boat's electrical system, modifications that would cause the system to fail after a certain period of operation but would not be immediately apparent during routine inspection. Wilson had claimed this was for an insurance investigation, suggesting the boat owner was planning to scuttle the vessel for a fraudulent claim, and Wilson wanted to help expose the fraud. Clark admitted he should have questioned this explanation more carefully, but the payment Wilson offered was substantial, and he needed the money. He was instructed to watch for a specific boat at the marina where Daniel regularly rented vessels, and when the opportunity arose, to access the boat and install a simple timer device that would short-circuit the electrical system after approximately 6 hours of operation. The installation took only 20 minutes during a period when the marina was nearly empty. Clark had completed the job on March 14th, 1 day before Daniel's fatal voyage. He had received the remaining payment from Wilson and had put the incident out of his mind until confronted 3 decades later. The mechanic insisted he had never intended to cause anyone's death and had believed Wilson's story about insurance fraud investigation. Detective Martinez now had a direct connection between Thomas Wilson and the sabotage that had killed Daniel Matthews. The next step was determining Wilson's motive. Why had a former business partner gone to such lengths to cause Daniel's death? The answer lay in the financial value of the underwater discovery and Wilson's attempt to claim it for himself. Further investigation revealed that Wilson had indeed known about Daniel's discovery in more detail than he had previously admitted. Phone records from 1993 recovered from archived telecommunications company databases, showed multiple calls between Wilson and Daniel in the weeks before the disappearance. The conversations had apparently been more extensive than Wilson's casual description of a single discussion suggested. Additionally, investigators discovered that Wilson had consulted with his own maritime lawyer just days after Daniel's disappearance, inquiring about salvage rights and procedures for claiming discovered materials in federal waters when the original finder was deceased or missing. The timing was extraordinarily suspicious. Wilson had begun positioning himself to exploit Daniel's discovery even before the compass maker's body had cooled in the ocean depths. The picture that emerged was one of calculated opportunism that had crossed into homicide. Wilson had learned enough about Daniel's find to recognize its potential value. When Daniel refused to bring him in as a partner, Wilson had apparently decided to eliminate the competition and claim the discovery as his own. The sabotage was designed to look like an accident at sea, leaving no evidence pointing back to Wilson while clearing his path to the valuable materials resting on the ocean floor. However, Wilson's plan had ultimately failed. The discovery had remained undisturbed for 30 years, never exploited by anyone. Perhaps Wilson had been unable to locate the precise coordinates, or perhaps the logistics and costs of deep-water salvage had proved beyond his capabilities. Regardless, he had committed murder for a prize he never managed to claim, leaving Daniel Matthews dead and a family destroyed for absolutely nothing. Detective Martinez obtained an arrest warrant for Thomas Wilson on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy. She also secured a warrant for Robert Clark on charges of manslaughter and criminal conspiracy, though his cooperation would likely result in reduced sentencing. After 3 decades, justice for Daniel Matthews was finally within reach, but the legal process of bringing his killer to trial would require careful preparation and ironclad evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. The case that had haunted Pacific Grove for 30 years was approaching its resolution, but the final chapter would be written not at the bottom of the ocean, where Daniel had died, but in a courtroom where his killer would finally face consequences for a crime committed in pursuit of nothing more than greed and the magnetic pull of easy wealth that had ultimately eluded him entirely. Monterey County Superior Court, April 2024. 6 months after the discovery of Daniel Matthews' remains and the evidence that transformed his disappearance into a murder investigation, Thomas Wilson stood trial for first-degree murder. At 71 years old, the former business partner faced the possibility of spending his remaining years in prison for a crime committed 3 decades earlier. The prosecution built its case methodically, presenting a narrative that connected motive, means, and opportunity. Lead prosecutor Amanda Richardson walked the jury through Daniel's discovery of the valuable metallic debris field, his consultation with a maritime lawyer, and his refusal to partner with Wilson on the exploitation of the find. Financial records demonstrated Wilson's precarious situation in early 1993, with mounting debts and failed business ventures that gave him powerful motivation to pursue the potentially lucrative salvage opportunity. The photographs recovered from Daniel's waterproof camera proved crucial evidence. Forensic analysts testified that the timer device visible in the final images matched exactly the type of sabotage Robert Clark described installing. The device's position and connection points corresponded perfectly with the thermal damage patterns observed on the recovered wreckage, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that deliberate sabotage had caused the electrical failure that sank Daniel's boat. Robert Clark testified for the prosecution as part of his plea agreement. Now 64 and visibly uncomfortable on the witness stand, he described in detail how Wilson had recruited him, the specific instructions he had received, and the payment he had accepted for installing the device. Defense attorneys attacked Clark's credibility vigorously, noting he had waited 30 years to come forward and was testifying only to reduce his own criminal liability. However, Clark's testimony was corroborated by documentary evidence the defense could not refute. The canceled check, phone records showing multiple contacts between Clark and Wilson in the days before Daniel's death, and marina security logs that placed Clark at the facility on March 14th all supported his account. The prosecution demonstrated that Clark had no independent motive to harm Daniel Matthews and no connection to him whatsoever beyond the transaction with Wilson. The defense strategy attempted to argue that Wilson had indeed hired Clark to examine the boat's electrical system, but for legitimate purposes. Defense attorney Marcus Green suggested Wilson had been concerned about Daniel's safety given his plans for deep-water exploration and had wanted to ensure the rented boat's systems were reliable. The timer device, Green argued, might have been installed by someone else entirely, or might have been a component of Daniel's own experimental equipment. This argument collapsed when the prosecution presented Wilson's financial records and his consultation with a maritime lawyer immediately after Daniel's disappearance. The timing and nature of these actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt and preparation to benefit from Daniel's death. Wilson's own words to the lawyer, documented in billing records and consultation notes, revealed he had been inquiring about claiming salvage rights to a discovery made by someone now deceased, someone he did not name, but whose description matched Daniel Matthews exactly. Emily Matthews testified about her father's character, his dedication to his work and family, and the devastating impact his disappearance had inflicted on those who loved him. Her testimony was powerful not because of emotional appeals, but because of her scientific expertise. As a marine geologist, she explained the significance of the rare earth materials Daniel had discovered and the substantial commercial value they represented. She established clearly that Wilson had sufficient motive to eliminate a rival claimant to a potentially lucrative find. Christopher Bennett provided expert testimony about the magnetic anomaly, the debris field, and the sophisticated level of research Daniel had conducted before his death. His evidence demonstrated that Daniel had been systematic, professional, and thoroughly prepared in his investigation. This undermined any suggestion that Daniel's death resulted from recklessness or inadequate preparation rather than deliberate sabotage. The most damaging testimony came from Wilson's own maritime lawyer, Michael Bradford, who was compelled to testify about the consultations that had occurred immediately after Daniel's disappearance. Bradford described how Wilson had asked detailed questions about claiming salvage rights when the original discoverer was missing and presumed dead. Wilson had specifically asked whether a former business relationship with the deceased finder would strengthen his claim to the discovery. These questions, asked before Daniel's body was even discovered, revealed not only foreknowledge of the death, but also premeditation in planning to benefit from it. The defense called few witnesses, recognizing that their client's position was nearly indefensible given the weight of evidence. Wilson himself chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment rights. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, suggesting the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a confessed accomplice seeking leniency. Prosecutor Richardson's closing statement methodically dismantled this argument. She walked the jury through each piece of evidence, showing how they interlocked to form an unbreakable chain connecting Wilson to the crime. The financial motive, the suspicious payment to Clark, the timing of the sabotage, Wilson's immediate consultation about salvage rights, and the physical evidence from the boat itself all pointed inexorably to one conclusion. Thomas Wilson had orchestrated Daniel Matthews' murder to eliminate competition for a valuable discovery. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Thomas Wilson was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances of financial gain. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Wilson showed no emotion as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge the moment that sealed his fate. Robert Clark received a sentence of 8 years for involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy, with credit for time served and eligibility for parole after 5 years. His cooperation and evident remorse weighed in his favor during sentencing, though the judge made clear that his actions, however unknowingly, had contributed to a man's death, and he bore responsibility for that consequence. Jennifer Matthews, now 72, attended every day of the trial. When the verdict was announced, she wept quietly, not from joy at the conviction, but from the profound relief of finally knowing the complete truth after 3 decades of uncertainty. Her husband had not abandoned her, had not died through carelessness or bad judgment. He had been murdered by someone he had trusted, someone who valued profit over human life. Emily Matthews stood beside her mother as the sentences were pronounced. For her, the resolution brought complicated emotions. Justice had been served, but it could not restore the 30 years her father had missed, could not give back her childhood with him, or erase the decades of wondering and waiting. The conviction of his killer marked an ending, but also confirmed that her father's life had been cut short for the basest of reasons: another man's greed. The rare earth materials that had cost Daniel Matthews his life remained on the ocean floor. Salvage efforts were deemed economically unfeasible given the depth, the deterioration of the containers after decades of submersion, and the legal complications of extracting materials from a site that was now officially a memorial and crime scene. The magnetic anomaly Daniel had discovered would remain undisturbed, a monument to his curiosity and the price he had paid for it. In a final, ironic twist, geological surveys conducted after the trial revealed that the rare earth materials, while valuable in 1993, had become far more common by 2024 due to new mining operations worldwide. Even if successfully salvaged, they would not have commanded the extraordinary value Wilson had anticipated. He had committed murder for a prize that, had he been patient, would have lost most of its worth anyway. The Pacific Grove community marked the resolution of the case with a memorial service for Daniel Matthews. His recovered remains were buried in a ceremony attended by family, friends, and many who had never known him but were moved by his story. A small plaque was placed near the marina, where he had rented his final boat, commemorating not just his life, but the reminder his death provided, that human greed can corrupt even the most promising discoveries, and that truth, however long delayed, eventually surfaces. Emily Matthews returned to her work in marine geology, carrying forward her father's curiosity about the ocean's hidden secrets. She established a scholarship fund in his name for students pursuing oceanography and marine science, ensuring his passion for understanding the underwater world would inspire future generations. Christopher Bennett continued his mapping work, occasionally taking his vessel out to the coordinates where Daniel's boat rested, maintaining the site's documentation and preservation. The case of the compass maker who disappeared in 1993 finally closed in 2024, not with the romantic discovery of treasure, but with the sobering confirmation that murder could remain hidden for decades beneath the waves, waiting only for technology and determination to bring it to light. Justice, delayed by 30 years and 130 feet of ocean water, had finally been served.